Greer had kept the boundary walls of Briarwood for 39 years, and he had developed, without ever intending to, the habit of noticing when things no longer quite matched the shape they used to have. Not the dramatic collapse of a gate or the obvious rot of a fence post. The small shifts, a hedgerow pushed 6 feet east over a decade, a drainage ditch that had migrated, little by little, across a field's edge. He had come to believe a county could be stolen that way, not in one crime anyone could point to, but in 100 quiet adjustments no single person thought to add together. He was thinking about this when he saw Maud Fenley come around the far side of the home meadow, at a pace that meant she was going towards something, not away from it. She was small and quick in her dark wool coat, the kind of woman you wouldn't look at twice in a market crowd until she opened her mouth, and then you looked once more and found you had underestimated her badly. The Earl's tenant, Widow Blythe, lived at the end of that path. Greer set down his shears and followed. By the time he reached the wicket gate, Maud was already there. 3 of Amos Pike's men were at the corner of Blythe's kitchen garden, their spades in the soft September ground, pulling up a fieldstone the size of a boot box that had been sunk there. Greer happened to know. In the same year he himself had come to Briarwood. It was a survey stone. It had a notch cut in its face, and a Roman numeral 3 chiselled beneath the notch, and it marked the northeast corner of the widow's holding. The widow stood in her doorway with her apron balled up in her hands, saying nothing. She had learned that asking questions when men came with spades was its own kind of expense. Maud did not shout. She walked up, set her leather folio on the dry stone wall, and stood between the men and the stone. She said, without raising her voice by so much as a quarter note, that the marker they were removing was a legal boundary monument, set according to the original 1797 deed of tenancy, and that she could give them the chain measurement from the wellhead to that stone within 2 links, if they wished to verify it before they continued. The man with the spade looked at her the way men look at things they do not expect to encounter and do not know what to do with. She opened the folio. She had, Greer would later tell anyone who stood still long enough to listen, the deed in there. The actual deed, not a copy. She read the boundary clause aloud in the flat, steady voice of a woman who had read a great many legal instruments and was not frightened by their grammar. Then she pointed at the survey stone, pointed at the wellhead, and told the man with the spade that if he wished to pace the distance himself, she would wait. He did not pace it. He looked at the other 2 men, and then he looked at the stone, which was now a thing with documents attached to it, rather than a simple rock to be moved. And he put his spade on his shoulder and said they would come back when Mr. Pike had reviewed the matter. They left. The widow set down her apron and pressed both hands over her mouth and did not make a sound. Maud went to her, said something quiet that Greer did not catch, and the widow nodded several times and went back inside. On the lane behind them, a horse had stopped. The Earl of Briarwood sat in the saddle in his dark riding coat, watching. Reed Carston was 33 years old and had been back on his own land for 6 weeks, after 4 years in which he had preferred the continent to the country that contained his wife's grave. He had a face that didn't offer anything for free, handsome in the way certain tools are handsome, built for function, not display. He looked at the stone, then at Maud. Then he turned his horse and rode toward the house without a word. That evening, word came through the housekeeper. Miss Fenley's temporary engagement, which had run 3 months past its original term, would conclude at the end of the fortnight. The land records were considered sufficiently organised. Her fees would be paid in full. Maud received this in the library where she had been working, with a candle burned down to its last inch, and 4 stacks of deed rolls sorted by ward. She read the note twice, then she set it face down on top of the nearest stack, picked up her pen and kept working. She had been born Maud Fenley, second daughter of Thomas Fenley, who had spent 30 years as assistant to 3 successive county surveyors and knew the boundaries of the northern district of Hertford County better than he knew his own back garden. He taught her chains and compass bearings the way other fathers teach their daughters hymns, early by repetition, as though survival depended on it. When he died of a fever in her 24th year, he left her his instruments, his professional knowledge, and $800 of debt to his business partner, a man named Gerald Soper, who had the receipt. Soper was not unkind in the way a man is unkind, when he does not think of himself as unkind at all. He settled the debt against what he called her share of the partnership, the share her father had never formalized in writing, which meant legally it did not exist. He offered her a position as copy clerk in the office, at a wage that did not cover her room. She answered an advertisement instead. The Briarwood estate required someone to organize 40 years of land records, which had accumulated in the library, in a state that the previous land agent, a decent and retiring man named Aldous Webb, had described in his last letter to the house as geological. She came 3 months ago. She had been reading the records the way her father taught her to read a landscape, not for what was written, but for what the writing assumed. The discrepancies began as small things. A field described as 14 acres in a deed from 1801, appearing as 11 acres in the estate ledger from 1815, a survey note referencing an elm tree as a boundary marker, and a separate document 3 years later making no mention of the elm and measuring the boundary from a drainage ditch instead. The elm was still there. Maud had gone and looked at it. The ditch was 12 feet east of where it would have needed to be to make the later measurement accurate. She had said nothing. She counted weeks the way a woman counts them when she has a plan that requires time. It was Greer who brought her the evidence she had not known to look for. He came to the library one morning with his cap in his hand and a folded paper that turned out to be a letter, sealed with plain wax, addressed in a careful old-fashioned hand to whoever reads these files next. Webb had tucked it behind the deed rolls for Ward 6 before he retired. Inside were 8 pages of handwritten survey notes. Webb had walked the boundaries quietly in his last year, alone, without telling Pike. What he had found and what the official maps showed were not the same thing. He had been old and unwell, and he had hoped whoever came after him would have more fight left in them. Maud read the notes twice, the way she read everything twice. Then she sat very still for a long time with her hand flat on the papers, not from doubt, from the particular, deliberate stillness of a woman who understood that caution was a resource and should not be spent before its proper moment. She found Pike's second set of maps on a Tuesday in the outer office, behind the official estate survey, which lived in a cabinet Pike had not thought to lock because no one, in his experience, had ever been interested enough in survey documents to go looking. The second set was labelled working copies in Pike's own hand, working copies that did not agree with the official versions. Boundaries moved, acreages reduced. The difference between what the deeds said and what the working copies showed was, when Maud added it carefully, 42 acres spread across 11 holdings, absorbed over 12 years into parcels reclassified as estate wasteland, then subleased on Pike's private authority to a timber merchant in the next county. She was still at the cabinet, with the working maps in her hands when she heard the door. Pike was a broad, prosperous-looking man, with a pleasant manner he wore, the way some men wear a good coat, consistently, whatever the weather. He looked at Maud, and then at the maps, and his manner stayed pleasant, which was the most frightening thing about it. He said that a surveyor's daughter was not a surveyor. He said that a woman hired to file papers who went looking beyond her brief was precisely the kind of woman whose character references required careful examination. He said the estate was preparing for its annual rent settlement, and that he would hate for any confusion in the records to cause difficulty for Miss Fenley personally, given that her position was, after all, temporary. Maud returned the maps to the cabinet. She picked up her folio. She said she was grateful for the clarification, and that she had, as it happened, an excellent memory for measurements, and that she looked forward to the rent settlement as much as he did. She walked out with her spine straight and her hands steady, and did not let her hands stop being steady until she was back in the library with the door closed behind her, and then only for a minute, because she had work to do, and not much time left in which to do it. She spent 3 evenings at Widow Blythe's cottage. The widow had lived on her holding for 30 years and had a memory for what her land used to look like that matched Greer's for precision and exceeded it for grief. Maud took her testimony down in writing. She went to the other affected tenants in the evenings, after their work was done, and she read each of them the relevant clause of their original deed, which some of them had never heard read aloud correctly, and she showed them the measurements, and she asked them to mark what they had actually paid and when. Old Greer walked the boundaries with her on 2 mornings before the light was full, carrying her father's measuring chain while she worked the compass. They found 7 of Webb's original survey stones. 3 had been moved. She recorded the found positions against the deed positions and against the working map positions, in a table so clear that a child could read the discrepancy. She told the tenants one thing more, that when the rent settlement came, they should be present, and they should come together, and that if they were asked to pay amounts that did not match their deeds, they should say they would wait for a second reading. The rent settlement was held in the estate hall. Pike sat at the table with the ledger open and his strong box at his elbow. Beside him, at the Earl's instruction, a solicitor from the county seat brought in to observe. Reed Carston stood near the window with his arms crossed. Present the way a man is present who has told himself he is fulfilling an obligation. He had not, Maud suspected, read any of the documents Pike had placed before him in the last 4 years. Reading the estate would have meant staying in it, and the living part of him had not yet been ready. She understood that. She did not forgive it yet, but she understood it. The tenants came up the path in a group. That was the first wrong sign, for tenants come singly, cap in hand, shuffling with the particular apology of people who have decided in advance that the numbers will not favour them. All 11 affected families came together, and they stood in the hall together, and when Pike opened the ledger and called the first name, the man who stepped forward set his payment on the table and then put his broad hand over it, and said he would be grateful if Miss Fenley could confirm the acreage before the amount was accepted. Pike laughed and asked what Miss Fenley had to do with a settled estate rent. The door opened. Maud Fenley walked in with a folio under her arm, Webb's sealed letter in her hand, and her father's measuring chain looped over her shoulder. It was old Widow Blythe, standing in the back of the hall with her arms folded, who said into the silence, "She's got everything to do with it." It was her that put the stone back. Maud set the folio on the table across from Pike's ledger. She named each document as she laid it down. The original ward deeds, Webb's private survey notes with the sealed envelope intact, her own resurvey conducted with Greer as witness, the recovered boundary stones, brought in that morning by 2 of the tenant men in a barrow, the Roman numerals still legible on each face, the working maps against the official maps, and the sublease agreements between Pike and the timber merchant, found in the outer office cabinet, executed without the Earl's knowledge or signature. No voice raised. Reed came away from the window. He stood across the table from her and read. She watched him read, and she watched the precise moment when it became something other than disbelief. He came to the document approving the 1819 boundary correction for Ward 3. 40 acres reclassified as estate waste, his own signature at the bottom. Signed without reading. She knew why. Reading the estate had felt to him like reading the last chapter of something he could not yet bear to finish. He said, in the flat, careful voice of a man choosing his words with full attention for perhaps the first time in years, that he had signed what was placed before him for 4 years without reading it, because reading his own land had felt like walking back into the room where his wife died. He said the man beside him had used a pen to take what these people had worked for, but that he himself had left the door open, and the estate had 2 men to answer for, not 1, and he intended to say that plainly and in front of everyone present. The county repeated that sentence for the better part of a year, and argued over it for longer, whether the steward or the absent Earl owed the greater debt to Briarwood's people. Maud never settled the argument for anyone. She thought the arguing was evidence of a community that had woken up, and that was its own kind of health returning. For Pike, there was no argument. His pleasant manner lasted perhaps 30 seconds after the sublease agreements were laid on the table, and then it left him entirely, and what was underneath was small and brittle, and absolutely certain of its own cleverness, in the way of men who have confused getting away with something for earning it. He told Maud she had found what she'd gone looking for by trespassing through a private office. She replied that she had been hired to organise the records of that office, that she had organised them thoroughly, and that perhaps next time he ought to employ someone less interested in getting things right. The county sheriff arrived before supper. At the subsequent hearings, Pike was convicted on the maps he himself had drawn and the subleases he himself had written. His bond was called. The sublease income, carefully tallied in Maud's accounting, was recovered and returned to the estate. The 42 acres were restored to their proper boundaries on the official survey and recorded in the county seat. The timber merchant, finding his arrangement suddenly without legal standing, departed without forwarding address. Maud's own business with Gerald Soper was quieter. Webb's letter had contained a footnote, one careful paragraph noting that he had, in his last year, corresponded with a solicitor regarding the partnership accounts of one Thomas Fenley, deceased, whose surviving partner had reported the firm's value at a figure Webb had considered considerably too low. He had not pursued it, he suggested mildly, that whoever read his notes might have cause to. Maud handed the footnote to the county solicitor, who had witnessed the rent settlement, and who had, by that point, a very clear understanding of what Maud Fenley's attention to documents could produce. Soper was offered a choice between a public accounting and an immediate settlement of the full disputed amount, with interest paid into the hands of a new trustee of Maud's choosing. He was a practical man, he settled. He drove out of the district, looking smaller than he had arrived, and was heard of thereafter only at a distance. Lady Paget came to Widow Blythe's cottage on the 4th morning after the rent settlement. She was 32 and handsome in the particular brittle manner of a woman whose composure has been maintained under conditions of considerable private strain, and she came alone, which cost her something Maud recognised and credited. She stood in the widow's plain sitting-room in her good pelisse, and confessed that she had written letters to acquaintances in the south, asking about Maud's background, and that she had passed what she learned to Pike, who had been prepared to use it at the settlement if the matter of the maps had not overtaken his plans entirely. She did not cry until she had finished. What came out then was not wickedness but terror, the specific bone-deep fear of a woman of 32 with 2 younger sisters, a mortgaged family property, and a future that had narrowed to a single question of whether a particular man would choose her. She had seen Maud as a threat to the only safety she had been taught to want, and she had done a cowardly thing, and she had come to say so to Maud's face. Maud thought of herself at 24, sitting across from Soper's desk, and understanding that the world had arranged itself in a way that left her very little room to move. She looked at Lady Paget and recognised the species of fear, if not its particular shape. She did not pretend the harm away. But she went to read, and it was Maud's asking that secured for Lady Paget the management of the new parish lending library at Ketford Village, which the Earl endowed that autumn at a proper salary, answerable to no husband's convenience and no suitor's goodwill. Within a year, the sharp attention that had once been turned on Maud's history was turned instead on which child in the village had come to the reading-room hungry, and on what to do about it. The county argued over that mercy too, and Maud let them argue, because she thought a county willing to argue about mercy was a county in better condition than one that had stopped noticing the question. Reed Carston came to Widow Blythe's cottage on a Thursday morning, on foot, which the village noted, hat in his hand, which it noted further. He had to negotiate with the widow's brown dog at the gate before the animal would allow him through, which Maud observed from the kitchen window and did not comment on. He did not offer excuses, which she noted. He did not lead with a position and follow with his reasons. He asked whether Miss Fenley, given that she now held the most thorough private record of Briarwood's boundaries in 40 years, would be willing to remain as permanent land agent, under proper terms arranged through her own solicitor, and direct the complete re-recording of the estate's survey. Maud said she would consider it on conditions. He said he was listening. First, she said, the boundary stones to be properly reset and filed with the County Record Office before the first hard frost. Second, every lease renewal from this day forward to be read aloud in full to the tenant before any signature was asked for, without exception. Third, that he himself read, completely and before signing, Every document placed before him from this point onward, without exception, and without the excuse of private grief, however legitimate that grief might be. He said those were 3 conditions, and that he accepted all 3. She said she was glad to hear it, and that there was a 4th, which was that the brown dog at the gate be given a proper name, as the widow had been calling it simply that dog for 2 years, and it deserved better. Reed looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man who has just discovered that he has badly misjudged the dimensions of a room he thought he knew. Then he laughed, a real one, not managed, and the widow, who had been listening from the hallway with the door open in the way that made it clearly not eavesdropping, told Greer the next morning that it was the first sound out of that man that had any life in it since he came home. They married in the village church in January, quietly, at Maud's preference, with Greer and Widow Blythe as witnesses. The tenants lined the churchyard path and threw wheat because they had decided collectively that this was the correct thing to do and had not asked anyone's permission. The brown dog was named Charter, after the document that had begun everything. In the spring, when the boundary restoration was complete, and every survey stone on the Briarwood estate had been reset and recorded in the new official maps, drawn in Maud's hand, checked against the originals, cross-referenced with Webb's notes and her father's tables, she held the first proper estate court of the new administration, with the doors open to the April air. The tenants came up the path together, not the old way, singly, braced for a number that would not match what they knew they had paid. They came as people come to a place they have decided to trust. Greer stood by the hall door with his arms folded, and if his expression was one of comprehensive satisfaction, he would have called it simply paying attention. Maud sat at the survey table with the new maps spread before her and ink on 2 fingers, and Webb's original letter framed on the wall at her back, where it could be seen by anyone who cared to look. Reed stood at her shoulder, not because the land business required him there, but because he had discovered. He liked the specific moment when the measured distances agreed with the deed distances, and the stones stood where the records said they stood, and everything in the room was exactly what it claimed to be. He had told her once, on a cold morning when they were walking a boundary line together, and she was reading the compass, and he was holding the far end of the chain, that it was the first time in 4 years he had been somewhere without wanting to be somewhere else. She had said that was a reasonable place from which to begin.